I never expected to find out who my father really was at his own funeral. Standing there in front of his coffin, surrounded by the murmur of mourners and the overwhelming scent of lilies, I reached for the small white card tucked into the spray of flowers, resting on the polished mahogany. My hands were shaking, not from grief alone, but from something I couldn't yet name. The card was simple, elegant even, with a single name written in careful script that made my breath catch in my throat. Rebecca. Just that. Rebecca. No last name, no message, no explanation. I stared at those 7 letters until they blurred, my mind racing through every Rebecca I'd ever known, every mention of the name I might have overheard in passing. Nothing. My father, Michael Harrison, the man who raised me in our quiet home in Portland, Oregon, who taught me to tie my shoes and ride a bike, who never missed a single one of my school plays even when work ran late, had apparently meant something profound to someone I'd never heard him mention once in my entire 32 years of life. The funeral home in downtown Portland was packed with people I recognized from my father's accounting firm, neighbors from our street, members of his bowling league, the usual collection of faces that populate a well-lived life. But as I scanned the crowd with that card clutched in my palm, I realized I was looking for a stranger, for a woman whose name felt like a key to a door I hadn't known existed. My mother had died when I was 7, a car accident that shattered our family into before and after, and my father had never remarried, never even dated as far as I knew. He'd poured everything into raising me, into making sure I never felt the absence of her more than I already did. He was devoted, present, almost obsessively focused on creating a stable, loving home for just the 2 of us. So who was Rebecca, and why did her name sit at his coffin like a claim, like a declaration that there were parts of my father's heart I'd never been allowed to see? I felt someone's hand on my shoulder and turned to find my father's younger brother, Uncle James, looking at me with an expression that seemed to carry its own weight of secrets. He was the only family my father had left after their parents passed, and though they'd been close, there had always been something unspoken between them, a kind of careful distance that I'd attributed to the different paths their lives had taken. James had moved to Seattle years ago, built a successful career in tech, married and divorced twice, lived the kind of fast-paced life that seemed entirely opposite to my father's quiet existence. He glanced down at the card in my hand, and I watched something shift in his face, a tightening around his eyes that told me he knew exactly who Rebecca was. My voice came out smaller than I intended when I asked him, barely more than a whisper against the soft organ music playing in the background. He looked around as if checking who might overhear, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint scent of his cologne. What he said next made the entire room seem to tilt on its axis, made every certainty I'd built my life upon feel suddenly fragile as glass. Uncle James told me that Rebecca wasn't just a name from my father's past. She was my mother's twin sister, a woman whose existence had been deliberately erased from our family history, scrubbed so completely from the narrative that I'd grown up believing my mother had been an only child, just like my father. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and making my knees go weak. I'd spent my entire childhood longing for extended family, for aunts and uncles and cousins who might have shared my mother's features, her laugh, her way of tilting her head when she was thinking. And all along there had been someone, a twin no less, someone who must have looked exactly like the fading photographs I kept in albums at home, someone who had chosen to disappear from my life so completely that even her name had become a ghost. James's hand steadied me as he guided me away from the coffin toward a quiet corner of the funeral home where heavy curtains blocked out the gray February afternoon. His voice was low and urgent as he explained that what I was about to learn would change everything I thought I knew about my family, about the accident that took my mother, about the man lying in that coffin who I'd believed I understood completely. The story James told me unfolded like a nightmare disguised as history. My mother, Catherine, and her identical twin Rebecca had been inseparable growing up in a small town outside of Boston, the kind of bond that only twins can share, finishing each other's sentences and feeling each other's pain across distances. They'd moved to Portland together after college, both landing jobs at the same marketing firm, sharing an apartment in the Pearl District, living parallel lives that seemed destined to continue in harmony forever. Then my father entered the picture, and everything began to fracture in ways no one could have predicted. Michael Harrison had walked into their office one spring morning to discuss his firm's advertising needs, and both sisters had fallen for him immediately, completely, with the kind of intensity that transforms friendship into rivalry and love into something dangerous. My father, young and probably overwhelmed, had chosen Catherine after months of carefully navigating the impossible situation, and they'd married quickly, perhaps hoping that speed might somehow ease the wound his choice had inflicted on Rebecca. But wounds like that don't heal, James said, his eyes distant with the weight of memories I wasn't present for. They fester, and they spread, and they poison everything they touch. Rebecca had tried to be happy for them at first, had smiled through the wedding and shown up for family dinners, and pretended that her heart wasn't breaking with every affectionate glance between her sister and the man she'd lost. She'd even been there when I was born, holding me in the hospital just hours after my arrival, tears streaming down her face that everyone assumed were joy, but that must have been something far more complicated, far more painful. For 7 years, she'd maintained the facade, had played the role of devoted aunt while dying inside, watching the life she wanted belong to someone else, even if that someone else was the person she'd loved most in the world before my father came along. Then came that rainy November evening when everything shattered beyond repair. When my mother's car skidded off Highway 26 on her way home from a late meeting, when the police knocked on our door at midnight with news that would redefine our existence. The official report called it an accident, attributed it to wet roads and poor visibility, and the unfortunate timing of a deer crossing the highway at exactly the wrong moment. But James's voice dropped even lower as he told me what had never made it into any official record, what my father had apparently carried like a stone in his chest for 25 years until it finally stopped his heart 3 days ago. Rebecca had been there that night, had called my mother just minutes before the crash, had said things that no one should ever say to someone behind the wheel of a car in dangerous conditions. James didn't know all the details. My father had been fragmentary in his telling, protective even in his confession, but the essence was clear enough. Rebecca had reached a breaking point, had unleashed years of accumulated pain and jealousy and longing in a phone call that had distracted my mother at the worst possible moment. The guilt had destroyed Rebecca, had sent her spiraling into a darkness so profound that by the time of my mother's funeral, she'd already disappeared, left Portland without a word, and vanished so completely that even my father's attempts to find her over the years had yielded nothing. He'd tried, James insisted, had hired investigators and followed leads and spent sleepless nights wondering if she was alive or dead, safe or suffering. But Rebecca had erased herself expertly, had perhaps felt that her existence in my life would be a constant reminder of what she'd done, a presence too heavy with tragedy to inflict on a grieving child who'd already lost so much. My father had made the impossible decision to let her go, to protect me from the complicated truth by creating a simpler narrative where my mother had been alone in the world, except for him. He'd packed away every photograph that included Rebecca, had asked friends and family to never mention her name around me, had built a wall of silence that he believed was an act of love, a way to give me a childhood uncomplicated by adult betrayals and impossible grief. And for 25 years, that wall had held, had kept me safe in ignorance, while my father carried the weight of Rebecca's existence and absence like a cross on his back. James's hands were trembling as he pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket, something he'd been carrying since my father's death, waiting for the right moment to give it to me. Inside was a letter, pages and pages in my father's careful handwriting, dated just 2 months before his heart attack, an explanation he must have sensed he needed to write before time ran out. The letter began with an apology, with words that seemed to reach across the divide between life and death, to ask for my understanding, to explain choices made from love, even if they'd resulted in lies. Reading my father's words felt like watching a stranger emerge from behind the mask of the man I'd known, revealing layers of pain and complexity I'd never suspected. He wrote about the early days after my mother's death, about how he'd almost broken under the combined weight of grief and guilt, and the responsibility of raising me alone. He wrote about Rebecca's disappearance and how it had felt like losing Catherine all over again, like watching another piece of her vanish into nothing. He wrote about the countless times he'd almost told me, almost sat me down and explained that I had an aunt out there somewhere, but had always pulled back, always convinced himself that the truth would hurt more than help, would burden me with knowledge I couldn't do anything about. But the most devastating part of the letter came in the final pages, where my father revealed that 3 months before his death, Rebecca had finally reached out, had sent him an email after 25 years of silence, asking if it might be possible to see him, to talk, to perhaps find some kind of peace before too much more time passed. They'd met just once at a quiet cafe in Seattle, where no one would recognize them, and my father wrote that seeing her had been like looking at a ghost. At Catherine returned, but aged by years, and sorrow in ways my mother never got the chance to be. Rebecca had changed her name, had built a new life in Vancouver, Canada, working as an art therapist and living alone in ways that spoke to her continued isolation from normal human connection. She'd never married, never had children, had apparently spent 25 years punishing herself for those moments on the phone, for words spoken in anger and pain that had led to consequences no one could undo. She'd asked about me, my father wrote, had wanted to know everything, had cried when he showed her photos on his phone of my wedding 2 years ago, of the woman I'd become without ever knowing she existed. She'd asked if she could meet me, if there might be a way to carefully introduce herself into my life, but my father had hesitated, had promised to think about it, to find the right time and the right words. Then his heart had given out before he could make good on that promise, and now here I stood with the truth spread out before me like broken glass, sharp and dangerous and impossible to ignore. The letter ended with my father's blessing, with his hope that I might find Rebecca and let her explain herself, that I might find it in my heart to understand the complexity of what had happened and perhaps offer her the forgiveness she'd been seeking for a quarter century. He'd included an email address, a phone number, tangible ways to reach out across the years and the silence, leaving the choice entirely in my hands. The funeral concluded in a blur of condolences and embraces that I barely registered, my mind too full of Rebecca to focus on the rituals of grief playing out around me. That night, alone in my father's house where I'd grown up, surrounded by the familiar furniture and photographs that now felt like props in a play I hadn't known I was performing, I sat at his old desk and stared at the contact information he'd left me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let Rebecca remain in whatever life she'd built, to maintain the simpler story I'd lived with for so long. But a larger part, the part that had always felt the absence of extended family like a hollow place inside me, needed to know more, needed to hear Rebecca's voice and see her face and understand what had really happened that November night so long ago. Before I could talk myself out of it, before fear could override curiosity, I typed out an email, keeping it simple and direct, because there were no words adequate for the situation. I told her who I was, that my father had died, that I'd found her name at his funeral and learned the truth. I asked if she'd be willing to meet me, to talk, to help me understand a history I'd been excluded from. Then I hit send before I could reconsider, feeling the message disappear into the digital void, with a mixture of terror and hope. If you've made it this far in the story, I need you to know something. I see you there, listening to words about family and secrets, and the complicated ways we try to protect each other, even when protection looks like lies. I'm not going to ask you to hit subscribe like you're doing me some kind of favor. Instead, I want to offer you something. This channel exists because stories like these matter, because the messy truth of how we live and love and fail each other deserves to be told and heard. If this story is resonating with you, if you're feeling something real right now, then stay with me. Become part of this community where we hold space for the difficult truths that make us human. Your presence here matters more than you know. And in the comments, if you feel moved to do so, tell me what you're thinking, what this brings up for you. Let's be real with each other in a way the world doesn't often allow. That's all I ask. Rebecca's response came within hours, arriving in my inbox at 3 in the morning when I was still awake. Unable to sleep in my childhood bedroom, with its familiar shadows and new, impossible knowledge. Her message was longer than mine, spilling out in paragraphs that seemed to carry 25 years of pent-up words, of things she'd wanted to say to someone who would understand the weight of them. She wrote that she'd been waiting for this moment with equal parts desperate hope and absolute dread, that learning of my father's death had broken something open in her that had been locked tight for decades. She wanted to meet, needed to meet, and proposed a place that made my heart ache with its careful thoughtfulness. There was a botanical garden in Seattle, a place my mother had loved, where Catherine had taken Rebecca during hard times when they were young, when the green growing things and quiet paths had served as sanctuary from whatever troubles they were facing. Rebecca suggested we meet there in 3 days, giving me time to process and prepare, to decide if I was truly ready to face the living ghost of my mother and hear truths that couldn't be unheard. The drive from Portland to Seattle felt both endless and far too short. Hours on Interstate 5 where I rehearsed conversations in my head that I knew would bear no resemblance to whatever actually transpired. I arrived at the Washington Park Arboretum on a Saturday morning that was unseasonably warm for February, the kind of early spring day that feels like a gift after months of grey. I'd studied photographs of my mother before leaving, had stared at her face until I could see it with my eyes closed, trying to prepare myself for the shock of seeing those features animated and alive again in someone else. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of Rebecca, standing by the entrance to the Japanese garden, looking so much like my mother that I had to grip a nearby bench to steady myself, had to remind my brain that this wasn't impossible resurrection, but something more complicated, more painful. She saw me at the same moment I saw her, and the expression that crossed her face was one I'll carry for the rest of my life. A mixture of joy and agony so intense it was almost hard to witness. We stood there frozen for a long moment, two strangers connected by blood and tragedy, and decades of enforced separation, neither of us knowing how to bridge the distance between us. Then Rebecca took a tentative step forward, then another, and suddenly we were standing close enough to touch, close enough for me to see that she had my mother's green eyes, but that they carried a sadness my mother's never had in the photographs, a weight that had settled into the lines around them and wouldn't be dislodged. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first, and I watched her struggle with the enormity of the moment before finally finding words. She said my name, just my name, Sarah, spoken like a prayer or a plea, and something inside me cracked open at hearing my mother's voice, or something so close to it that the difference hardly mattered. We walked through the garden slowly, two women navigating a conversation that kept threatening to overwhelm us both with its emotional magnitude. Rebecca told me everything, held nothing back, and I listened with a mixture of compassion and anger and grief that shifted moment by moment. She described what it had been like to love my father, to watch him choose her sister, to smile through the pain while dying inside. She talked about the years of trying to accept it, of dating other men who never measured up, of watching my parents build the life she'd wanted with someone else wearing her face. Then she came to that night, and her voice broke into pieces as she described the phone call, the things she'd said in a moment of weakness after years of holding everything in. She'd told my mother that she was a thief, that she'd stolen Rebecca's future, and didn't even have the grace to feel guilty about it. She'd said that every happy moment Catherine experienced was built on Rebecca's suffering, that their twin bond had been a lie, because a real sister would never have done what Catherine had done. And Catherine, always the peacemaker, always the one trying to smooth over conflict, had been crying and trying to respond, and promising they'd talk it through when she got home. Rebecca's last words to her sister had been harsh and unforgiving, and then the phone had gone silent except for the sound of impact, of metal tearing and glass shattering, and Rebecca had stayed on the line screaming Catherine's name into the void until emergency services had arrived at the scene and someone had picked up the phone and asked who she was and what her relationship was to the deceased. The guilt that followed had been comprehensive and annihilating, Rebecca said, had convinced her that she was a murderer, even though no court would ever charge her with a crime, even though technically my mother's death had been ruled accidental, and no one but Rebecca, and eventually my father had known about that final phone call. She'd tried to attend the funeral but had collapsed before entering the church, had been found by my father in the parking lot, having what the doctors later called a complete nervous breakdown. He'd helped her, had taken her to a hospital, had visited her during the weeks she'd spent in psychiatric care, and when she'd finally been released, they'd had a conversation that had shaped the next 25 years of both their lives. Rebecca had told him she needed to disappear, that seeing me would be impossible, that every time she looked at my face she'd see Catherine's and remember what she'd done. My father had argued at first, had insisted that Catherine wouldn't want this, that I needed family, that Rebecca was punishing herself beyond reason. But eventually he'd accepted her decision, had understood that sometimes the only way to survive unbearable guilt is to remove yourself entirely from the situation that caused it, even if that removal creates new kinds of pain. So Rebecca had changed her name from Rebecca Mitchell to Rebecca Moore, had moved to Vancouver and built a life of careful isolation, had poured her pain into helping others through art therapy while never quite managing to heal herself. She'd thought of me every day, she said, had wondered what kind of person I was becoming, had felt the absence of my presence in her life like a physical wound that never quite closed. When she finally found the courage to reach out to my father, it had taken her weeks to compose the email, to find words that might bridge such an impossible gap. Their meeting in Seattle had been brief but profound, and my father had been kind, had told her about me with a father's pride, had shown her that I'd grown up happy and healthy and loved despite the tragedies that had marked my early years. He'd promised to think about how to tell me, how to reintroduce her into my life without destroying the peace he'd worked so hard to build for me. But his heart had failed before he could make good on that promise, and now here we were, meeting without his mediation, two women trying to navigate a relationship that should have been simple but was anything but. I want to pause here and say something to everyone who's still with me, who's invested in this story and in what happens next. You being here, listening to these complicated truths about family and forgiveness, and the impossible choices we make when there are no good options, it means more than I can express. I know I could ask you to share this video, or leave a comment like it's some kind of transaction, but that feels wrong for a story like this. Instead, I want to invite you into this space we're creating together. If you have a story about family secrets, about learning something that changed how you saw your past, about the complicated work of forgiveness, I want to hear it. Share it in the comments, not because I'm asking for engagement metrics, but because your story matters, because it deserves to be witnessed and held with care. And if there are other stories you think need to be told on this channel, experiences that deserve light and attention, tell me about those too. This community we're building is about more than just views and subscribers. It's about recognizing our shared humanity in all its messy, painful, beautiful complexity. So please, be part of this conversation. Your voice belongs here. The question of forgiveness hung between us as we continued walking through the garden, past blooming camellias and dormant trees, waiting for spring's full arrival. I wanted to tell Rebecca that I forgave her, that I understood the impossible position she'd been in, that jealousy and pain can make us say things we don't mean, with consequences we never intended. But the truth was more complicated than easy absolution. Part of me did understand, could imagine the torture of watching someone you love choose your identical twin, of having to see your own face reflected in the happiness you'd been denied. But another part of me, the part that had grown up without a mother, that had navigated childhood grief and adolescent loneliness and all the milestones my mother should have been present for, that part struggled with the knowledge that Rebecca's moment of weakness had contributed to my loss. The accident might have happened anyway. The roads were genuinely dangerous that night, but we'd never know, and that uncertainty felt like its own kind of burden. Rebecca didn't ask for forgiveness directly, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. Instead, she talked about the decades she'd spent trying to forgive herself, the therapy and the medication, and the careful construction of a life that might justify her continued existence despite what she'd done. She'd helped hundreds of people through her art therapy practice, had specialized in working with people carrying unbearable guilt, had poured her own experience into understanding and easing others' suffering. She'd created beauty and healing in the world as a kind of penance. though she was clear-eyed enough to know that no amount of good deeds could ever balance the scales or bring my mother back. She'd simply tried to live in a way that honored Catherine's memory, that might make her sister proud if Catherine could somehow see what Rebecca had become. The life she described sounded lonely, marked by a kind of self-imposed exile that extended beyond just avoiding our family. She'd kept relationships at arm's length, had never let anyone know her fully, had maintained a careful distance from deep connection, as if she didn't deserve it. I asked her what she wanted now, what she hoped might come from this meeting beyond unburdening herself of a story she'd carried alone for so long. Rebecca looked at me with such vulnerability that it was hard to hold her gaze, and she admitted that she didn't know, that she'd fantasized about being part of my life but had no realistic expectations, no demands to make. She said she understood if I needed to walk away after this conversation, if knowing her would be too painful or too complicated, if the best thing for me was to let her remain in the past where she'd been for my entire life. But there was hope in her eyes too, a fragile thing that she was trying not to show too obviously, and I realized that what she wanted more than anything was simply to be allowed to know me, to have whatever small place in my life I might be willing to offer. She wanted to hear about my childhood, about the woman I'd become, about the ways my father had raised me, and whether I'd inherited anything from the mother I'd lost too young. She wanted, I understood, to have a piece of Catherine back, to see her sister's legacy walking and talking and living in the world. We talked for hours that day, moving from the garden to a quiet cafe nearby where we sat across from each other, and I told her stories about growing up, about my father's devotion and his occasional bewilderment at raising a daughter alone, about the ways I'd grieved for a mother I barely remembered but missed nonetheless. Rebecca listened with an intensity that felt like hunger, asking questions and laughing at the funny parts, and crying openly at the sad ones, no longer trying to hide her emotions or maintain any kind of protective distance. She told me about my mother in return, about their childhood in Boston, about the sister Catherine had been before she became my mother, stories and details that filled in gaps I'd never even known existed. She described how Catherine had always been the braver one, the first to try new things, while Rebecca had been more cautious, more thoughtful, following her sister's lead into adventures she'd never have attempted alone. She talked about their shared language of glances and gestures, the way they'd been able to communicate without words, finishing each other's thoughts and feeling each other's emotions across any distance. Losing that connection, Rebecca said, had been like losing a limb, like suddenly being incomplete in a way that never stopped aching. As the afternoon light began to fade and we both realized we'd been talking for nearly 6 hours without pause, I found myself facing a decision that would shape the rest of both our lives. I could thank Rebecca for her honesty, could acknowledge the courage it took to tell me everything, and then walk away, keeping her in the past where she'd been since I was 7 years old. Or I could take a risk, could choose to see her not just as the woman whose jealousy had contributed to my mother's death, but as a human being who'd made a terrible mistake and spent 25 years paying for it, who deserved a chance at redemption and connection, and maybe even joy. I thought about my father, about the letter he'd left me, about his hope that I might find it in my heart to offer Rebecca forgiveness, and perhaps something more. I thought about all the years I'd wished for extended family, for an aunt who might have known my mother, and could tell me stories about her, who might understand the particular grief of losing someone you loved too much. And I realized that Rebecca, for all her mistakes and all the pain she'd caused, was exactly that person, the closest thing I would ever have to my mother walking the earth. I reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand, feeling how it trembled in mine, how she seemed almost afraid to hope that this gesture meant what she thought it might mean. I told her that I couldn't promise forgiveness right away, that I needed time to process everything I'd learned, to integrate this new understanding of my family's history into the narrative I'd been living with my entire life. But I also told her that I didn't want to lose her again, that I wanted to try to build a relationship, to see if we could find a way to be aunt and niece, despite the complicated circumstances that had kept us apart. I said that it wouldn't be easy, that there would probably be difficult moments when the grief and anger rose up and made me question whether this was the right choice. but I was willing to try if she was, willing to take the risk that knowing each other might bring more healing than pain, that the connection we could build might honor my mother's memory better than continued separation ever would. Rebecca's tears were a flood then. Years of held-back emotion finally allowed release, and she gripped my hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. She promised to be patient, to follow my lead, to accept whatever relationship I was comfortable offering without pushing for more. She said she'd waited 25 years and could wait however much longer I needed to feel safe and sure about letting her into my life. In the months that followed that first meeting, Rebecca and I began the slow, careful work of building a relationship from scratch, of learning who each other was beyond the tragedy that connected us. We started with emails and phone calls, brief conversations that let us test the waters without the intensity of face-to-face interaction. Then we progressed to monthly visits, meeting halfway between Portland and Vancouver for lunch or walks, gradually extending the time we spent together as the awkwardness faded and genuine affection began to grow. Rebecca was careful never to try to replace my mother or claim a place in my life that she hadn't earned, but she was present in ways that mattered, showing up when I needed someone and giving me space when I needed that instead. She told me more stories about Catherine, shared photographs I'd never seen, gave me pieces of my mother that my father either hadn't known or hadn't thought to preserve. Through Rebecca, my mother became more real to me than she'd been since her death, transformed from a collection of fading memories and idealized fantasies into a complete person with flaws and strengths and a history that extended beyond her role as my parent. What surprised me most was how much Rebecca and I were alike, how we shared gestures and expressions and ways of thinking that couldn't be explained by shared genetics alone, since we weren't biologically related. But then I realized that these similarities came through my mother, that I'd inherited Catherine's mannerisms, and they were reflected in her twin, creating a strange kind of familiarity between Rebecca and me that felt both comforting and occasionally unsettling. Rebecca noticed it too, would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare at me with wonder, telling me that the way I'd just tilted my head or laughed at something was exactly how Catherine had done it, that being with me was like having a piece of her sister back. I understood then what she'd been looking for in reaching out, why she'd been willing to risk rejection and pain for the chance to know me. I was the living bridge between Rebecca and the person she'd loved most in the world, the way her sister continued to exist in the world even after death had taken her away. I introduced Rebecca to my husband, David, who was initially skeptical, but gradually warmed to her as he saw how important the relationship was becoming to me, how it was filling spaces I hadn't realized were empty. We invited her to holidays, started including her in family celebrations, gave her a place in our lives that felt natural despite its late arrival. She was there when I got the promotion I'd been working toward for years, there when David and I suffered a miscarriage that broke both our hearts, there for the ordinary moments of life that make up the bulk of existence between the dramatic turning points. And slowly, so gradually I almost didn't notice it happening, the question of forgiveness became less urgent, less central to our relationship. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when I stopped seeing Rebecca primarily through the lens of what had happened that November night and started seeing her as simply my aunt, a person I cared about who enriched my life by being in it. The forgiveness came not through any grand gesture or explicit conversation, but through the accumulation of small moments, through the slow building of trust and affection that eventually outweighed the tragedy in our shared past. A year after our first meeting, on what would have been my mother's 57th birthday, Rebecca and I drove to the cemetery where Catherine was buried, where my father had been laid to rest beside her just months earlier. We stood together at the joint headstone, two women bound by loss and love and the complicated work of healing, and Rebecca spoke to her sister for the first time in 25 years. She told Catherine that she was sorry, that she'd never stopped being sorry, that she hoped Catherine could see that she was trying to make amends by being there for the daughter she'd left behind. She said that she missed her every day, that the world had been less bright without her in it, that she'd give anything to take back those final words and have one more chance to tell her sister how much she loved her. I added my own words, telling my mother about the aunt I'd found, about how knowing Rebecca had given me a new understanding of who Catherine had been, a more complete picture of the woman whose absence had shaped my entire life. I told her that I thought she'd approve of what we were building, that she'd want us to have each other, that love was always better than separation, even when the circumstances were complicated and painful. As we drove back to Portland that evening, Rebecca and I talked about the future, about the possibility of her moving closer so we could see each other more frequently, about the hope that someday I might have children who could know their great-aunt and hear stories about the grandmother they'd never meet. We talked about my father, too, about how he'd carried the weight of our family's secrets alone for so long, trying to protect me from pain while bearing his own in silence. Rebecca said she thought he'd be happy to know we'd found each other, that his greatest hope had been that we might build a relationship that honored all the love and loss that had shaped our family's history. I agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones, understanding that this was exactly what my father had wanted when he left me Rebecca's contact information and his blessing to seek her out. He'd known that healing was more important than protecting me from difficult truths, that I was strong enough to handle complexity and brave enough to choose connection over comfortable ignorance. Looking back now, I can see how that simple card at my father's funeral, that single name written in careful script, was actually a gift, a last act of love from a man who understood that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the carefully constructed lies we tell ourselves and each other. Finding Rebecca didn't erase the grief of losing my mother at 7 or the pain of growing up without her, but it added dimensions to that grief, gave me a living connection to the woman I'd lost, and taught me that forgiveness is not a single decision, but an ongoing practice, a choice we make again and again to see people in their full humanity rather than reducing them to their worst moments. Rebecca will never stop carrying guilt for her role in my mother's death, and I will never forget that her jealousy contributed to my loss. But we've both learned that people are more than the worst things they've ever done, that healing is possible even from wounds that seem too deep to mend, and that family, chosen or given or found after years of separation, is always worth fighting for. So now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your understanding of your family, of your own history? Have you ever had to decide whether to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, even if they never meant to cause that pain? Have you ever found a connection you didn't know you were missing until suddenly it was there, filling spaces you'd learned to live with empty? I want to hear your story, whatever it is, however it ended. This channel exists to hold space for these kinds of truths, for the complicated, messy realities of how we love and lose and find each other again. Tell me what you're carrying, what you've learned, what you wish you'd known sooner. And if you know someone else's story that deserves to be told, that needs to be witnessed and honored, share that too. Your experiences matter, your voice matters, and I'm here to listen. So please talk to me in the comments. Let's build something real together, something that honors the full complexity of what it means to be human and connected and forever changed by the people who shape our lives, for better and for worse and everything in between.